Good morning. This is Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church with your thoughts for Thursday. This week we've been looking at references to God's grace throughout the Bible. And in James chapter 4, he gives us a recipe for receiving even more grace. He says there in that passage, "Do you think that the scriptures say in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously? But he gives more grace. Therefore," he says, "God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble." James is talking about that inward struggle that goes on in every person. And he reminds us that friendship with this world is actually enmity with God. So when we're struggling with temptations and trials, even struggling with Satan himself, he promises he gives more grace. Whatever you need to combat sin and Satan, God provides that grace. And there is a definite recipe here for that abundant grace. He said, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And you realize those who are proud and sort of self-sufficient don't really think they need God's grace. They don't really think they need God for that matter. They can handle everything on their own. But it is only by God's grace that we're strengthened, that we're enabled to live for him and resist the devil and his attacks on our lives. The key is he gives more grace to the humble. Only those who will humble themselves before God and seek his face can realize that their need of God's grace is supplied. Even more grace is given to those who humble themselves before. So when we receive this abundant grace from the Lord, here's what we do. Verse 7, he says, "Therefore, submit yourselves to God, fall into his loving arms of grace." He also says, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. We recognize that the grace of God will strengthen us and allow us to resist him and whatever he tries to do in our lives. Verse 8 says, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Again, a part of this recipe is the fact that the grace of God enables us to draw closer to him day by day. And when we draw nearer to God, we will follow him with these actions. He goes on to say, cleanse your hands, you sinners. We'll correct our actions. We will stay away from the things that soil our hands and our souls. He also says, purify your hearts, you double-minded. We dig deeper and we recognize that in our hearts is where we really need God's grace to help us to be more pure. All of these things come when God has given us more grace. And the way you find that grace, you humble yourselves before the Lord. So let's appreciate God's grace today even more in our daily lives.